in today's discussion, how do you conduct useful, impactful, valid market research on a budget, on the cheap? And so there's a bunch of ways. I want this to be a really open conversation and very relaxed. I did put together a few slides. I'm going to put a couple things up, not because I'm going to go off a slide deck, but because I really just want to show you guys what I put together. So, because this will be a resource that you can gain access to after today's discussion that I strongly recommend that you grab. I've got I don't know. I know I only look like I'm 20, but I've got about 3 decades, literally 3 decades of experience conducting market research. I've surveyed nearly 300,000 executives, principally in IT decisions, business people, small business owners around the world. Most of that work has been in North America. A big chunk of it's the United States. But I've done research in literally 18 different languages in 21 different countries. I've traveled the world to do research. And so I've really gained a lot of ideas and insights and experience on what works and what doesn't. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Using data is so important. And, we all see a lot of market data. There's so much market data all over the place, free stuff, right? And so in this deck, which I'm not going to go through, and I'm going to take the slides off in a second. I just want to preview it to you guys. What I talk about is when you get data from other people, so that's the stuff in green, and when you conduct your own market research. And so you'll see I've got some tips here on using somebody else's data and some things to make sure you always do. And then when you collect your own data, some tips here as well, and then things to make sure you always do. So I'm going to walk you guys through it without actually sharing the slides. You'll be able to get these slides after the event. They'll come to you via email. You can also download them from our website. But today we're going to talk about, how do you gather market research? One of our themes this year is data-driven decisions. And so, people have been making a lot of decisions from their gut. How they feel about things has become more important in today's, kind of social context and discourse. People are using the opinions of quote unquote experts or others as a source of truth. And so I really wanted to talk about gathering market data because a single person's opinion is really important, but it may not necessarily reflect the underlying market. And so getting that experience with gathering those market perspectives and learning how to use them as effectively as necessary. And, you probably are already doing that, but there's just maybe a couple little tips or tricks that I could bring to your attention that'll help you do it even better. So let's start with using somebody else's data because that's what I think we all do a lot, right? There's loads of data points all around us. You do a Google search, you're on LinkedIn, you see a document act, there's tons of statistics. 70% of people say that when they use Microsoft Copilot, it really helps them do their job better, increases productivity. That's a statistic that you'll see. 73% of millennials want to work for a company that is diverse. Right. So you'll see all these kind of statistics everywhere. There's statistics in everything. And so a lot of times folks just grab them and they run with them. And so suddenly, you'll see a stat and it might be a little bit flawed, or maybe it's from a really small study. Maybe it's only for people in a certain geo. And people will grab that stat and they'll kind of tweak it a little bit and then they start to run with it and somebody copies their stat and next thing you know, this data point, which may not be fully accurate, is kind of worked its way around the world. And it's kind of like that game, when you got a circle of kids and, somebody whispers something and you see what happens when it comes around. And data is very similar. So what I want to help you guys do is that's all good when you're, chit-chatting with friends, but when you're trying to make your business decisions, your strategic plans, making a business case, you're making an investment, or launching a new product, you name it, right? Where you really need accurate data, an accurate perspective of the market. You don't want that data point that's been I guess you could say, spun a little bit, and it may not actually represent the true market. So how do you avoid that? The first thing is whenever you see any statistic used anywhere by anyone, even if it's a highly reputable, publication or organization, have they should have properly cited it. So really good data is always properly cited. So, and people who respect good data when they're, writing a report or, publishing an article or a perspective, they're going to have, I guess people call it receipts, right? They're going to cite that data somewhere. You may not see data citations in social media, even though will see lots of statistics there. So I wouldn't encourage you to, pull data from a social post, for example, because it's generally not going to be properly cited. But you could probably take that statistic and type it into Google, and then it'll pull up the underlying data source. So the first thing is to make sure you find that data source, right? Number one is see how old it is. So when was that date, that study or that, data, that finding, the survey, the poll, whatever it was, when was it done? When was it conducted? If it's within, I'd say 18 months at the absolute outside, if it's within 18 months, then it's probably still usable. You're starting to get a little stinky, right? If it's 18 months old, it's getting a little bit old. If it's within 12 months, then okay, you can definitely start to think about using it. If it's, within 6 months or less, then it's okay, yeah, right? You want to keep going to see. So there's still more questions for you to ask if you should use that data to base your business decisions off of it. So at least 12 months, at least 12 months young, right? Next, after you've seen that it's, relatively recent data, then you want to have a look at what that data was. What's the study? How many people were involved? Where was it conducted? Was it incentivized? What's the they call that the methodology, right? What's the method in which that data was gathered? For example, Vistage, which is a big coaching organization, and the Wall Street Journal, for many years has done small business confidence research. And so they survey quite a lot of small business owners and CEOs and stuff. And then they publish it. I think they do it every quarter. And so something like that, that's longitudinal, and it's got a really stable methodology. They publish that really often, and they publish the underlying findings really often. Things like that, you can, when you find a resource like that, absolutely grab onto it, check it regularly, because they're often going to publish that kind of stuff, on a regular basis, and it's going to have a really solid methodology. But you want to look at that underlying study and see how many people they talk to. Some folks are out there throwing out statistics from a study of like 10 people, right? That's really not a great idea. So that takes us to the next question, which is how many people do you need to talk to for it to be statistically valid, right? Quote unquote. So, back in the day when I used to do a ton of that kind of, statistic or significance testing is what it's referred to by statisticians. There are certain types of statistical tests, t-tests, p-tests, you name it, that folks can do when they're doing that kind of research, that will test for the margin of error. So people don't talk about that anymore. But back in the day, when I was still young, that was like a big deal, it's that margin of error because it could swing. And so you conduct these, significance tests to see what's the margin of error so that the statistic that you have, which might say, 70% of, certain type of people want to do something. Well, there could be a margin of error of, let's say, plus or minus 6%. So it could be 64% or it could be 76%. That's that margin of error. And that super matters. Because if you're trying to use that to make a decision, launch a product, set a price, enter a market, you name it, that swing, that margin of error could really matter in terms of your, potential adoption rate. And so you really want to understand that. So back to the question I was asking, which is how many people do you need to talk to? Well, they say you can survey as little as 39 people and still conduct a t-test, I believe, and get a margin of error. So you can calculate statistical significance on that data set. There's like 1,001 disclaimers, right? Who are you talking about? Is the sample representative of the underlying market? How big is the market? There's loads of things like that. So without, boring everybody with statistics, I'd say that, somewhere between, you know, 30 to 50 responses to a survey, assuming that they're sampling people, that the target decision maker, small business owners, IT professionals, women with curly hair, right? As long as they've got a solid sampling methodology to choose people randomly or, that represent that audience, then generally, you could probably start working with that data. If it's much less than that, 10 people, 20 people, a lot of, researchers refer to that as, it's like opinion research. It's anecdotal. You might hear that word. So it's not really what they would refer to as statistically significant or valid. Obviously, the more is better when it comes to data. So 10,000, right? Facebook did a study. They do this attitude study every year. Last year's study, they did, I think, 21,000 platform users around the world. So, that's pretty good data set. Now they've got, I think, 3.5 billion users. So does that fully represent their whole audience? Maybe or maybe not, but 21,000 is a pretty good swath, and that would give you a good data to kind of dig into and get some perceptions. So first, check how old that data point is. Then see what was the underlying study and how many people they talked to. And then you want to start to see if you're really going to use this data for your planning purposes. Then you want to dig into it and start to look at what was the actual question that was asked, and how was the question phrased? What were the options they could choose? And really get into it. Whenever you use somebody else's data, you always have to proceed with caution, even if it's from a really reputable source, because that author or that journalist or that commentator may be trying to make a point that's not what your point is, and so they might be looking at that data from a slightly different lens than you plan to use it, and because of that, you may interpret the data differently than they do or than the research actually intends. So it's so important for you to actually get the actual data point, not just the stat that person pulled out, not that the author pulled out, but you actually want to look at that actual study and look at it yourself, see the questions asked, and interpret it. So those are some really tips and tricks. There's a ton of data out there. You can Google search just about any topic, stats about AI adoption, stats about how many women wear high heel shoes, you could research anything and you will find some statistics about it. Their whole websites dedicated to just pulling data like that and aggregating them. So there's a ton of data points out there that you could gather and that I encourage you guys to go out and check, right? Check out a lot of this research. It is useful. It'll give you ideas. And that's really the most important thing that you can do is to see what studies are being done, see what people are talking about, see how people are interpreting that data, and it'll give you some good ideas. So now let's shift over to the next part, which is, well, okay, you can gather a bunch of data for free. And you can just put in a little, it's called desk research, right? You put the time in to find it, to gather the underlying study, analyze it, and go into detail. And that's one really great way to get it for free, in terms of cash money, of course you got to put your time into it. But in those cases, it may not be exactly perfect for what you need. Maybe you want to launch a product for women of color and you're interested to see if women of color, want a certain type of, clothing or undergarment or something like that. And there might not be a lot of research specific to what you really need to know. There might be some research around it that'll give you some guidance, but it may not be exactly what you need to make your business decisions. And so you might be asking yourself, what do I do? How do I answer that important business questions? Or do I just roll the dice? I would encourage you not to roll the dice. And so now we're going to talk about, well, how do you gather your own data? There are so many ways you could gather your own data. The best way for a small business owner in particular, the larger the company you work for, the more people expect you to do kind of some, statistically valid studies. But if you work for a smaller company, you can go out and do a little poll, right? A little opinion poll. You can use social media. You can use your company's social media if that's appropriate, for your brand. You can create a little online survey, Jot form, Google Docs. There's a ton of free Survey Monkey. There are a bunch of free survey tools out there that you can use and create a little survey, and then you kind of go around and you poll a few people. So remember, we talked about how much data is necessary for it to be statistically valid, right? And so a lot of people say 50. A lot of researchers, hardcore, researchers might say you need to have at least 50, but preferably 100. They call them responses. And you probably aren't going to get that far with your internal research, and that's fine. 10, 20, 15, that kind of opinion poll would be so helpful for you. Just talking to 10 or 20 possible, the people who fit your targeting. Let's say if you were making, something for women of color, go walk down the street, or post in a group chat, do a little online survey, post in a LinkedIn group and ask for opinions. It's going to be really helpful for you because you're going to talk to people who one day you might be offering your or presenting your product to. But it'll also give you some really great perspectives from talking to those people. You can ask them to take your little survey, or you can just ask them some free form questions. So what are some tips to keep in mind if you're going to do that? So the first thing is just keep it super duper simple. Ask very simple, straightforward questions that people could answer with one word. Things that I've found that work really well. Like I said, I've surveyed more than 250,000 people, probably like 300,000 people over the last 30 years. That's only 100,000 folks a year. And I've conducted thousands of studies, and I've asked all kinds of questions. Some of them to go great, some of them fail horribly. So what I've found is really short, simple questions that could be answered with one word are the best, or like a short phrase. So really great ones are, what are your top challenges, related to insert, issue? What are your top priorities? What are your goals? What are your plans? Where are you planning to invest? Those are all examples of very short, very simple questions that you could answer with, one word or a single phrase. Top challenges, issues with security, lack of budget, low, not enough staff, not enough time, lack of ideas, right? Those are really easy. It's called a pick list, easy pick list items, really simple question. Those types of things, they're going to be very well presented to your potential survey audience, and they're going to be really easy to answer. People can answer a question like that in less than 30 seconds, which is your goal. Hardcore researchers will say what you're looking for is a survey that's going to take people less than 5 minutes, preferably 3 minutes. So that's 6 questions maximum if they are going to take approximately 30 seconds per question. You might be like, oh my gosh, 30 seconds isn't very long. Well, the average TV commercial is 30 seconds. So you tell me, is that long? It feels like forever, right? When these commercials are running. So what you really want is a question they can answer in 10 or 15 seconds. They could read it and, read the options and choose the ones that matter to them. The longer the question, the more words, and the more words in the options that they can choose, the harder it will be for anybody to answer that question, do so accurately, and the less likely that they're going to put the time in to answer that question accurately. So keep it really simple and keep it really short. So 6 questions or less is what we recommend. There are times when you're going to have more than that. So when do you decide? How can I get up to 10 questions, for example? That would be, you might have some yes and no's in there. What's your, do you like hot dogs? Yes or no, right? So that's a 5-second question, really simple. You might be offering an incentive, and so in that case, people may be willing to spend more time on your survey. And so maybe you're offering a little, a gift card or something like that. And so people will give you more attention. But what we find is if it's going to really go beyond, I'd say on the real outside, 10 minutes, then you're going to have a really hard time completing that survey. So back to your small business owner, you want to offer something, you will have a product that you want to offer to women of color, and you want to gather some research. So you could go somewhere where you're going to find a lot of women of color that might represent your audience. And you can actually have a little survey on paper, and you could talk to them. You could have it on a tablet, for example, an online survey, and you could talk to them. You could post it in chat, and you could gather data that way. It's nice to have a survey rather than just having conversations. Having conversations is great too. That's called like a focus group, like a mini focus group. That's what people refer to that. Usually a focus group is together in a room, but you can do like individual interviews, interview-based research, and kind of treat it kind of like a virtual focus group. Sometimes people refer to it that way, and you gather people's opinions. That's really great. And you get a lot of candid opinions. You'll get a lot of really unique perspectives. But when it comes to reporting it out, I talked to 20 people, 50% of them said this, 25% of them said that. Focus groups and opinions, opinion-based research or interviews are really difficult to report in that way. So that's why a lot of times over my experience, I've done both. I've actually done almost every kind of research there is, except for maybe medical research right now. But I find I really love short surveys. I love the graphs. I love the reporting to see the data come. And that's the easiest way to gather that insight. And you can always, like I say, in every question, you give people an option to say other or don't know. So then that way you're not forcing them into answering, choosing the options that you've laid out. But what I find is that short survey is really very helpful. And for you, if you're a small business owner and you're out there gathering that data, like I said, having those conversations will be priceless for you. You'll find it so valuable. You'll get a lot of insight. You'll get some rejection too, which will be good because it'll prepare you for what it'll be like when you're out there presenting your product. But having a survey will really guide your conversation. Even when you do interviews or when you do kind of these sort of focus group type, discussions with people, you should still have a list of questions that you'd like to ask and get answers for to guide the conversation so that it has some structure. So short survey, less than 5 minutes, 3 would be perfect. Each question should take 30 seconds or less to read and answer. Short and simple question, preferably it's one line, less than 30 words. Simple responses, preferably 1 word each or a short phrase, 3 or 4 words. And as I mentioned before, it might be, top questions or questions that I find that yield a ton of valuable data and that are very easy to read and answer would be, what are your top challenges? What are your, top priorities? Where do you plan to invest? What are the biggest barriers? What are the, most common roadblocks? Who's involved in the decision? Really simple questions like that. But they actually yield a ton of data. When it comes to the options that they can choose, well, how many should you have? Could you have a whole list of like 100? I would not recommend that because, again, back to keep it simple and short, people have to read all those options to choose one. So our rule of thumb is 10 or less. If you're doing research or you're conducting a survey about something a little bit complicated, and maybe you need more than 10 options, you can go up to 15. Once you start to get past 15, then it starts to get a bit long, and you can do that, but then it would mean you're not going to ask 6 questions. You might only ask 4 or 3. Again, like I said, the goal is that a person taking your survey could read it and complete it in 5 minutes or less, preferably in 3 minutes. So that would be that's really going to be that attention span. 30 years ago when I started surveys, I could do a 19-minute survey, you guys, without an incentive, CIOs, small business owners, people would sit and all these things were conducted over the phone, and people would sit for 19 minutes, 16 minutes, and answer 20 questions or something like that, about their IT purchasing and the economy and stuff like that. The average decision maker doesn't no longer has that kind of attention span or willingness to participate in research. So over these 30 years, society has changed a bit, culture and I guess you could say social norms have changed. And so people's ability and interest in conversing over the phone has gone way down. They are very likely to participate in an online survey, but, we're in a high threat, environment. So there's lots of scams and things like that. So people are very cautious and, reticent. So you want to make sure that, keep it short, keep it simple, make sure you have a really good digital footprint, use a well-known platform like, Jotform or Google Docs. Google Docs has a Survey Monkey, those are really great ones. And they're free, they don't cost much. There are others out there like them, but you want to use a well-known platform, and you want to make sure your digital footprint is good too. So, if you're doing a survey, make sure you have your website there and you've got a little bit about your company and why you're doing that research and, participate. So we talked about using surveys to talk about prospects. So these aren't people you know. But you can conduct a bunch of research with your customers. So let's say you've already got customers. You could do a little quick survey, talk to 5 or 10 of your customers. They're going to be very likely to participate in your survey. I still would recommend you keep it to, 6 questions or less, where it takes them 3 to 5 minutes to participate. And I still would encourage you to offer them a small little just enticement, $10 Starbucks gift card, or send them a little gift, a iced cookie with your logo on it, something sweet to show them you appreciate that they participated in your survey. All those things are really great, but your customers are going to be very likely to participate and very likely to give you feedback. That takes me to my next point, which is, what are you going for? What you really want to do is make sure you create an environment and a scenario where they'll give you really honest feedback. And so that takes me to the next part of, why are we gathering data in the first place, right? My gut right here is good. It's got 30 years of knowledge, so I don't need to do market research. I would say that what I hope that we're all going to do as we move forward is that we're going to source more insight and perspectives from more people. And so that's why market data and research is so important, because, social norms are changing really fast right now. The way in which people interact and collaborate with each other is constantly changing thanks to technology, whether it's AI or social media or you name it. And as a result, it is more important now than ever to actually always get that temperature check on what's going on in the market. Gather some insight, get really candid, honest perspectives from, the market, from your competitors, from your peers, from your customers, because there might be things happening in the environment that you didn't take into consideration or you weren't as aware of, because look, we're all great business people and we're on our P's and Q's, right? As my mom would say. But things are changing so quickly that certain things might be popping up that we just weren't aware of. And so that's what makes market data, gathering it on a regular basis and creating an environment where people can give you candid, honest responses is so important. And even then, people will give you answers, but it still might not represent the market. So, we did a survey last year where we asked people, well, when would you most likely like to participate in a virtual discussion about business topics like this one, for example? And they were like Monday afternoon, Friday morning, different, they gave us some, I think Monday, Wednesday, and Friday were the most commonly cited days of the week. And, it was like around noon in the afternoon were the most commonly cited times a day. And so we've tried events at those times. And, do you know that from our actual, so again, research, we've tried all the different times that study, and it was like maybe 50 people, that study yielded. But we also tried it out. And what we find is still Thursday afternoons, which weren't the top responses, still had the best results. So research gives you a perspective, and it's really important to really challenge that perspective and really do a lot of investigation to arrive at what might be the best insight. And it's a process. So, and all of those things is you can still do it for a very little limited budget. Um, and I try not to say free because our time is valuable, right? But you can do all those things for your time. So, and so that's back to conducting research. Survey your customers. That is really something that companies have not are doing a lot less of than what they used to do 30 years ago. Customer satisfaction used to be a very important parameter for a lot of companies, and now we've gotten into a world where it's a little bit more transactional. So for you guys as business executives and leaders, I strongly encourage you to reevaluate that. Customer satisfaction research and perspectives from your customers is hugely valuable and will yield such great perspectives. And it might, you might get some stuff back that you don't want to hear. They might give you a little bit of heat about one thing or another. You guys are slow with this, and the quality of that wasn't as good as I wanted. But what I always say, and when I get feedback from clients that doesn't make me want to smile, thank the Lord, I only get that very, very seldom, but I do get it. We all do. When I do get that, I'm so grateful for it because I would prefer to get that feedback before it becomes an issue than to lose that customer because I didn't take the initiative to ask, are you happy, right? Ask them, how satisfied are you with our work? What else could we do to improve it? And to go that route. So that's what I'm gonna do right now, right? I'm gonna live by my word. So I've got a small number of people in the room, and there might be some folks watching us on LinkedIn. So I'm gonna ask you guys some questions. So, in the second half of this, we keep these discussions short. So we're about 30 minutes in. So in the second half of this conversation, what would you guys like to discuss? We've talked about gathering data from third-party sources. A lot of that stuff can be done for free. There's lots of data online. And so we talked about some tips and tricks and hacks on how to really get good data for free by doing desk research. And then we just spent about 10 or 15 minutes talking about how you can conduct your own research. You can create an online study, you can do a virtual focus group, you can do an actual focus group, you can have interview-based research, and you can do that with prospects, customers, employees, and or suppliers. And all of those will yield really great perspectives and insight for you to make your business decisions. You can survey a small number of those people. It may not be statistically valid, but it'll be extremely helpful for you. Of course, if you're a small business and you only got 20 customers and you survey 5 of them, you've actually surveyed 20%, 20%, you've surveyed 25% of your customers. And so, that would be a very statistically valid portion of your underlying data set. And so, that just surveying those 5 people will give you really great perspectives. What makes it so important to gather data these days? And I'll start to talk about indices and market data like Bureau of Labor Statistics. You see that a lot. Census data, current population survey, CPS. There's a ton of really great government stats. That's some of the best data out there, that government data. And so I'll shift my attention to talk about some of that. A lot of folks don't use that kind of economic data in their decision making, and so we'll talk a little bit about it to see if it might be a fit for you guys. Last part of our conversation today, so we talked about using somebody else's data and gathering that online insight for free online. We talked about conducting your own research and some tips and tricks on how to do that really successfully. And again, also very cost effectively, especially if you're going to conduct that yourself. We've talked about how much data you could gather in order to, really get meaningful amount of data about your customers or your target audience or what have you, where you can use it anecdotally or you can use it to guide your decisions. And so now we're going to talk about indices and statistical or government data. So that's there's the government has some, especially and actually for the most part in every Western country, the government has like a statistics office or a bureau of statistics. In the United States, there's actually multiples. In other countries, there might be multiples. Big data points that you might see would be, employment numbers, job openings, layoffs, hiring, unemployment, that kind of stuff. It's a real, what people refer to as a leading indicator about the health of an economy is how likely are people working? How many people are there working? What are their ages? Where are they located? What are their genders? What's their, even race? What's their ethnic background? The Bureau of Labor Statistics is the big agency here in the United States. Most of us would be familiar with that because we see every month the BLS is what, industry experts refer to it. BLS publishes a jobs report. And so you hear the news a lot, right? All the news people talking, oh, the jobs report was good, it was bad, whatever. And so that's a real leading indicator about the health of the economy. It's not always exactly an indicator. Just because unemployment is low, for example, may not mean that everybody's working. Some folks just decide to go on welfare, and that's literally the truth. Or they might just, decide not to work. Maybe they have a bunch of savings. And so if they're not pursuing a job, then they actually wouldn't be counted as unemployed. So, back to what we talked about earlier of making sure you understand and you get the definitions of, key parameters. And so reading the jobs report is a really great example of that. Making sure that you can get a lot of different perspectives. Not everyone will agree on the interpretation of that single report. Some folks will be like, oh, this is great. And other folks will be like, oh my gosh, this is horrible. And I strongly encourage you to look at both. I find, over my career that I actually seek out the different perspectives, and that by seeking out those different perspectives, I often, add to my insight and add to my knowledge, because there are things that I might not have paid attention to or noticed. Definitions really matter. And so when you're looking at Bureau of Labor Statistics data or BLS data, like the jobs report, make sure that you get a strong understanding of the definitions, for things like who's unemployed, who's out of the workforce. They're going to report all those things, but it's important for you to, and there's usually a little table somewhere, make sure you get those definitions so you can interpret it and come to your own conclusion, but also, listen to what others are saying. One thing that I will present to the group is, I know in today's day and age, they refer to, this person's an expert and that person isn't. I find that everybody has an important perspective and they bring, a perspective to the conversation. And so I would encourage you to look at lots of different perspectives because, what one person might find to be really important may have a different lens depending on what community you're in or where you are or what your background is or what your situation is. And so getting multiple perspectives when you interpret, like even something as what seems like, as, banal as data statistics, like about employment might have a lot of different interpretations. And so getting those different interpretations will help you come to the interpretation that really is going to give you the perspective that you need for your business decision. So Bureau of Labor Statistics is a good one. They pump out data all the time, you guys. They have a lot of data. They've been doing it for decades. They've got very rich data sets. It's a good leading indicator about the workforce. Another big one is the Census Bureau. So the Census Bureau, again, every 10 years they're doing, is it 10 years? Every 10 years they're doing a census, might be every 20 years. I think it's every 10. They're doing a census of some sort. It's a big deal. They did one in 2020. They generate a ton of research over those 10 years. They publish a lot of stuff. The thing with the census data is it's not fresh. So it's so much data that they gather. It takes them really a long time, years to publish all of it and, write reports about it. And there's so many facets to it. It's amazing data, really big data sets. It's incredible. Researchers love it, academic researchers and all sorts of folks. It's amazing. Um, but it's not fresh, so it's not like they did it last year. They're still publishing stuff from the 2020 census, and they're going to keep publishing it. All kind of different perspectives. So census data is rich. It's absolutely valid, but it's not always fresh, and so some of the things that they might have asked in that census may have changed by the time that you're accessing it. You can get all this data is free. You can go to any of these BLS.gov, census.gov. You can go to all those websites. You can download a ton of data to use. Again, super important for you to know all the definitions. So, and they're going to be in any report that they publish. They're going to be in the data tables. Some of the raw data, like that researchers could access, may not have all those annotations with all the definitions. So if you're not really experienced with that data set, I would not encourage you to just jump right in and use it. I would encourage you to gather somebody else's analysis of it. The census and the BLS publish reports regularly. I would encourage you to start there and get your knowledge and expertise up about that data set that you're looking at, and learn the definitions that way. They really matter, very important. And become more familiar with the data. Once you're more familiar, then you can go get wild and start working with raw data if that matters to you. Now, the census has got a ton of data that you might not realize, and depending on your business, you might actually be able to use some of that data to understand interest in certain things. Like they ask things about, are you going to start a business? They might ask about how many people in your household, or what are you going to invest in? Are you adopting something? Are you using things? They're asking lots of different questions like that in the census surveys. The census also conducts a business census. So they publish that. I think it's every 5 years, the establishments study. And so that tells you, how many businesses are there, how many of them by certain size, how many locations do they have, lots of stuff like that. And over the last 3 decades, they've been asking more questions, different kinds of questions, to the citizenry and to the business audience that they survey as part of these census studies, and they're asking more questions. So that's a great place to go. Like I said, it's not always fresh. It might take a few years for them to publish some of that stuff, but it's still good to use. It gives you some really great perspectives. And if you take it with a grain of salt that, some of that stuff might have changed a little bit, it is like some of the most valid research that you can get. They have great economists and statisticians and stuff that work for the organization. Really fantastic work. And so that's going to be really good stuff for you to look at. So Bureau of Labor Statistics and the census, go there and check it out. Really great stuff. Now, if you sell to small businesses, the Small Business Administration also does research, and they have some excellent research reports. They do, is it their frequently asked questions? I know it's not a very sexy title for a study, but every year, I think it's around this time, we probably should be seeing one come out pretty soon. They have this kind of frequently asked questions about the small business market. They publish it, and they tell you how many small businesses are there, how are their jobs of changing, what is the confidence. They just have a bunch of really great statistics for small businesses. Last year's report said it was 33,532 532,000 small businesses in the United States. Wow, right? So many. A lot of change during the pandemic. Very interesting findings in that. And so the Small Business Administration is really a great home for macroeconomic data around the small business market. Now, they don't do, or they haven't been doing things about like confidence, like what I referred to earlier, that Wall Street Journal and Vistage study that they do. I think they do it quarterly. The Small Business Administration doesn't do that sort of stuff. And but they have been doing some things about, are small businesses looking at AI or using certain types of technology, or how they're using the internet, those sorts of things. And so they can have some really great data around that. It tends to be very macro, in perspective, all of these agencies that I've referred to that have fantastic data, those data are like macro data, which means it's about the whole market, the whole economy, and it's really designed to help us and policymakers and business people understand that whole, the entirety of that, the job market, or the work, the labor market, the census, and the small business segment, as a whole. And so it's really not going to give you like attitudes or intentions or anything like that, but it'll give you a really great basis upon which to build your projections. How many employees are there, how many people, how many households, how many businesses, how many locations, that sort of stuff. Really great macro data that is very important to have in your forecasts and in your planning process if you don't already have it. Now, the bigger the company, the more likely you have that stuff. The smaller the company, where we have 13 jobs that we're doing, you may not have time to gather that information. So I would say, take a little bit of time out each quarter, go check out some of these data sources. It will absolutely fuel your view of your market. In addition to those federal agencies, which give you a picture of the whole country, each state also has bureaus that report statistics about the state. And that's how you can get more, and each city might even be reporting data as well. And so that'll help you to get a perspective for your market, because the smaller your business, the more focused you are on a particular geo. Not not every small business is constrained to their local market, but many are, and particularly if you're in services or retail or things like that. And so really getting a bead on what's going on in your city economically, and from a macro perspective, city, state, government, federal, would be really helpful. So if you're not in the habit of doing that, then I would strongly encourage you to do it. There's, each of these organizations generally have great quarterly and annual reports that they're publishing, and their websites are usually meant to be really helpful. They often put out press releases that are very easy to understand. They're designed to be that way so that, it's not just data experts that can read that stuff. It's meant to be so that the average business person, the average small business owner could read it and get some key points from it. And so I would strongly encourage you guys to make that part of your routine of gathering market data if you're not doing it today. So what are some other great sources? So I talked about government sources. Now there are others. There are other agencies. The FBI does crime stats, if that matters to you. There are other agencies that NTSB does things about like collisions and stuff. All these government agencies generally have metrics that they report, and that can be really helpful depending on your industry. And so definitely take some time. You'll find in our post-event deck, where we have some tips and tricks and hacks. That's one of the things that I'll say is, make sure you take some time to identify, those key data sources out there that, present data points that are relevant to your job and to your sector. And if you're not doing it now, and, I understand, because we all have 47 jobs. If you're not doing it today, then see if you can schedule an hour, next month to, take some time to identify a few of those indices and check it out, check out the press releases. But what I haven't talked about there's some other stuff, big guys that have great data. So I mentioned a big study from Facebook about trends and attitudes. That kind of stuff is very rich to give you some perspectives of how, different cohorts, different generations perceive things. Obviously, folks consider Facebook to be older people. I think of it as younger people. But each network might have, a big study or user analysis that they might have done about their, users, whether it's Instagram or, WhatsApp or what have you. That'll give you some perspective about their audience. And again, depending on what industry you're in and what role you're in, those kind of perspectives might be really helpful for you to get an understanding of, attitudes, social norms. How are people communicating? What's their perception of what's going on in the world? What's important to them? How do they make decisions? Those sorts of things are really helpful to add to your process of gathering an increasing amount of knowledge and expertise about your market and how to talk to them. So I would encourage you to look at that kind of stuff. Google Trends. So if you're not doing search ads, you might not even know that this thing exists. But Google has a tool, Google Trends. It has some other search tools, and there are other folks that kind of adapt it. But billions of people are doing searches, every day. And so Google has a tool where you can go and see how many searches there are for certain words, for certain phrases in certain areas, and it really can give you a lot of detail. Again, it takes some time for you to use it, and it's really helpful if you go in there with something on your mind. Like, so the example we used earlier was, maybe you're making a product for women of color, maybe it's undergarments or something that you're going to differentiate for women of color, because of the skin tones or something. And so you go out and you gather a little bit of data by talking to a few women of color, and they tell you, oh no, I don't like this, and I don't wear nudes because the color's wrong or it's hard to match or whatever, right? And so you get some perspectives. Maybe it validates some of the things that you thought. Maybe it tells you some things you got to work on. And so then you might hop over to Google Trends and see, well, are women searching, right? Nudes for darker skin, nudes for skin tone, right? And so you might use Google Trends to see if people are searching for that. So then you might, well, what do I use that for? Well, there aren't very many searches, that might give you an indication. It may not say that nobody wants your product, but it'll tell you that there aren't a lot of searches for that product. So what does that mean? Well, it might mean you have to do more work to educate your potential market that your product exists, right? So it might change your marketing strategy knowing that there aren't a lot of searches. And maybe you had this idea, like, oh, I'm going to make hot sauce flavored deviled eggs, right? I don't know. I just came up with that. But maybe say, okay, and this is going to be great. Everyone's going to love it. I'm going to sell 1 million of them. Well, again, you go to Google Trends and you would search, and maybe there's already 1 million searches for hot sauce flavored, deviled eggs. And then you go and you see, okay, well, there's already 100 different providers of that. And so, yes, you could go and offer that because there is demand, but it's also very competitive. So using a tool like Google Trends will give you a different kind of data, but that data combined with the other perspectives that we talked about could give you an even deeper insight into the possibilities and the potential for your products, for your services, or for your offerings in your market. Now, there are a few other tools like that. There's SEMrush, there's Moz, there's HubSpot, there's a bunch of tools out there where you could go and gather perspectives from their platforms, and their platforms are very well adopted. And so they would be able to give you a lot of insight about what are common keywords, what's the authority rank of certain things, and give you that kind of data. That sort of data is really helpful as well as part of your whole, strategy to gather more perspectives and more insight and more data to make your decisions. And so